Good morning to you. Welcome back from spring break. You had a good time? Yeah? Good. I want to hear about a few of the highlights later, but for now, what I want to do is I want to spend a little time with you sharing a story with you. It's really a journey, a very personal journey, and the reason I want to share it with you is because I truly believe, based on what I've seen the last few years, that the messages here can impact your lives tremendously. And for me, that's a great honor to be able to spend this time with you and try to do that. I want to thank first Mr. Curry and Mr. Zan Gary for their invitation to come here. And they model in such a great way for you all what I'm going to talk about in the context of leadership and service to your community. I want to talk about some concepts that are within this Season of Life book. And as I say, I really call it my Season of Life journey. What I want to start with this morning is a definition for you. In fact, what I want you to do first is wipe out a definition from your mind. I want to redefine for you the word success. If you can just eliminate everything you've thought about, heard about, all the messages you've been hit with about what it supposedly means to be a successful man or woman in this world, I want to take that all away and replace it with a new definition, but it's really the oldest definition of all. The very first Webster's Dictionary was published in the year 1806, over 200 years ago. And back then, if you wanted to know what it meant to be successful in this world, it was defined by only 4 words. And those words were prosperous, fortunate, happy, and kind. Now think about those last 2 words for a minute, happy and kind. Guarantee you pull out a dictionary off the shelf today, look up the word success or successful, you will no longer find the words happy or kind. Where did they go? When? Why? Why has that happened in our culture? And what has replaced those words? Think about the fact that every single day when you wake up in the morning, there is no one else in this world except for you who can decide for you whether you're going to spend that day being happy and kind. Fully 50%, half of the way to that original definition of being successful. And then I want you to think about the word coach, because I'm going to talk today about a football coach and his messages for this world beyond the fields of play. That word coach, we have so many images of what a coach is today. We have business coaches, life coaches, we certainly have athletics coaches, and not all of those images are entirely pretty these days, are they? First use of the word coach in the English language was in the 1500s in England, and the meaning then was a horse-drawn carriage. But it wasn't just any old carriage. The definition had a specific purpose for that carriage. And the purpose was to transport a person of importance from where he or she is to where he or she wants to be, needs to be, or ought to be going. Now, I make the argument today in 2007, all these years later, that that's exactly what we ought to be expecting of, and in fact demanding of, our youth sports coaches in America. Taking our people of importance, our young people, you, from where you are to where you want to be, need to be, or ought to be going. Understand that that has absolutely nothing to do with points on a scoreboard or league titles or state championships. Let me talk about Season of Life, the book, for just a few moments. Season of Life is a book about a man named Joe Ehrmann. Joe Ehrmann is the main character in that book. He was a football star back in the 1970s. Played for a team called the Baltimore Colts before they were the Indianapolis Colts. Joe was one of the star players on that team. He had been an All-American at Syracuse, first-round draft pick in the NFL, ended up becoming a defensive captain for the Colts and one of the real leaders of that team, both on the field and off. I had the great privilege and opportunity as a young boy, starting at the age of 11, of being a ball boy for the Baltimore Colts at the same time that Joe was one of the star players for that team. I worked, lived with, and traveled with that professional football team during the summers of my childhood. What a way to grow up with guys like Joe Ehrmann, Ray Oldham from right here in the Chattanooga area was one of the players on the Colts at that time. To be able to share a childhood and grow up around men like that, who were kind of older brothers in a sense, they were kind of surrogate dads as well. The book is also about a program called Building Men for Others. Building Men for Others is all about tearing down what our culture gives you as boys and men about what it supposedly means to be a man in this world, and it replaces those with what Joe calls strategic masculinity. And we'll get to the girls and the women piece in just a moment, so don't let me lose you girls on this. But for the boys and the men, we're fed 3 lies every single day in our culture about what it supposedly means to be a man. At a very young age, we learn that it's about athletic ability. If we're a better athlete than the other boys, then somehow we're elevated and led to believe that we're a little better than or a little more than they are. Get a little older and the second piece comes in, the second lie of masculinity. We're led to believe that sexual conquest makes you a man. Now, I'm not talking about healthy relationships. Nothing better in the world than a healthy relationship. I'm talking about the notches in the belt kind of mentality. I'm talking about the men in this world who think that somehow if you can draw women around you for your own purposes and desires, that somehow makes you a better man. Understand that does not make you a man at all. What that makes you is a user of other people. And then you get a little older, and the third piece comes into play, economic success. That's all about what kind of car you drive. How big is your house? What is your zip code? What's your job title? Issues of power and privilege and prestige. What's in your bank account? This stuff has absolutely nothing to do with being a man of substance and impact. And then you've got, for the girls and the women, understand that those 3 lies, slightly adjusted for you all, apply equally as well. For the girls at a young age, it's about body type and size, and more these days, athletic ability as well. Get a little older and that becomes about attractiveness to the boys and later to the men. And then that third piece comes into play as well, material possessions. How are you as a woman defined by these so-called standards of Madison Avenue and the advertising world and what you're supposedly striving for in this world? So it's all about tearing down those lies that our culture gives you every day and then replacing them, in the case of Building Men for Others, replacing them with strategic masculinity. There are only 2 pieces to that. The first is relationships, the ability to love and to be loved, the ability to define what really matters to you in your world by your interactions with others. If I were to know that I was going to be hit by a bus this afternoon and I was walking around here the last day of my life, what would I be asking myself? What kind of questions would really matter to me? Would I be pulling out my wallet to see what's in there? Would I be reminiscing about this beautiful house I built or my job title? I don't think so. I think the questions would be, what kind of husband was I? What kind of father? What kind of son? What kind of classmate? What kind of citizen in the community? What kind of brother? I think those are the type of questions that are ultimately going to define the way you look back on your life. The ability to love and to be loved. And then the second piece, the only other piece according to Joe and according to this whole season of life model, having a cause beyond yourself. Now, you can have a cause that's large, you can have a cause that's small, you can have multiple causes or a single cause. But this means that you are looking beyond your own individual hopes, dreams, and desires. That's all about serving other people. Joe calls it a transcendent cause. It's beyond you. If I were on that same deathbed this afternoon, I would look back and ask myself those relationship questions, and then I'd want to know that I had that cause. I'd want to know that I lived, I loved, I learned, and somehow, because of that cause, I was able to leave this world a little bit better place than it was when I got here. Relationships, and a cause. It's also a book about fathers and sons. I'll get to a personal piece of that in just a few minutes. Ultimately, I think Season of Life and this whole discussion is about principles to literally change the world around you. Now, that's not pie-in-the-sky stuff. That's not anything I've ever said about anything else I've ever written or been involved with. But that's how strongly I feel about these messages. That's how much they've impacted my life. And that's how much I've been able to watch and observe as others around the nation, first these boys in Baltimore, and now all over the country, have applied these principles to their own lives and to the lives of their families and friends. The strangest thing for me, 3 or 4 years into this journey, is that it's a book I never even set out to write. What happened was I was at my breakfast table in Washington, D.C. in 2001, and I was reading the newspaper. For me, it was the Washington Post, and I was eating my breakfast. And I saw a small little item in the newspaper that morning that said Memorial Stadium in Baltimore was about to be torn down, about to be demolished after all these years. The Colts had moved away. The Baltimore Orioles baseball team had played there as well. They were moved to a new stadium, and this stadium was going to be demolished. Well, I was lucky not to choke on my Cheerios that morning. That's how emotional my response was to seeing that my childhood home away from home, Memorial Stadium, was going to be gone forever. So I decided I wanted to take one last walk through that stadium before it was gone. Just kind of reminisce. And then I was also going to write a story for the Baltimore Sun about the reflections of an old Colts ball boy as this stadium was going to be torn down. Went up on a cold January morning, walked around the stadium for about an hour, and as I was leaving, I kept wondering to myself, what am I going to write about this tired old collection of concrete and brick? What I kept thinking about wasn't concrete and brick. I kept thinking about the men who had brought that place to life, the Joe Ehrmans, the Ray Oldhams, all those Colts players and coaches from throughout my childhood. I decided that instead of writing about the stadium, I was going to write about those men. And over the next stretch of time, the next several months, I set out to find every single guy who had played for that team during the 10 years, 1974 to 1983, that I was involved. Turned out to be 212 men now scattered all over the country. The 85th guy I was able to track down was Joe Ehrman. Now, in 2001, Joe was a very different person than he was 18 years earlier. I had not seen or talked to Joe for 18 years. And in the first phone call after all that time, we reconnected immediately. I came to learn that Joe was now a pastor in Baltimore, a minister, pastor of a church with about 4,000 members. He was the man responsible for building the first Ronald McDonald House in Baltimore, now having served about 35,000 sick children and their families throughout the years. He had started a program for racial reconciliation in Baltimore called Mission Baltimore, a subject that desperately needed attention in that city. He had started an inner city ministry called The Door. And oh, by the way, Joe said toward the end of this phone call, I'm also coaching a little high school football on the side. Now, Joe wasn't coaching because he cared a whole lot about high school football. Joe was coaching because he wanted to run this program called Building Men for Others. I kept asking myself, what might I learn from him now after having learned so much from him as a kid? I went to his first practice that year, summer of 2001, and what I saw on that football field was unlike anything else I'd ever seen before on a field of play. I saw a high school football coach standing before his football team, about 100 boys, junior varsity and varsity, sitting in the grass in the end zone at one end of the field. And I saw a coach stand before those boys and yell out, "What is our job?" Our job meaning the coaches. And the boys yelled back in unison, "To love us." "What is your job?" the coach yelled out, and the boys yelled back, "To love each other." Now, I thought that was the strangest thing I'd ever seen in sports in my life. And I kept asking myself, what could this possibly have to do with high school football? Well, I came to learn that that signature exchange had everything to do with high school football because their team was really not about team. Their team was about community. Everything that they were doing with that football program was building a community. Let's take a step back for a minute and go back to those 3 lies about false masculinity for a minute. Athletic ability, sexual conquest, economic success. And real quickly look at where those leave us as a culture. See, what that does is it does not allow us to build the kind of communities we want. Because if we're living by those 3 lies, how can we as boys and men, and therefore girls and women as well, how can we possibly connect with each other and build the kind of communities we want if we're always comparing and competing based on those 3 lies? See, that leaves us with a culture that's got all kind of violence, all kind of chaos, all kind of confusion, all kind of emphasis on material things, and it does not allow the kind of communities that we want to build. So there I am. What is our job? What is your job? Now, that's a lot of touchy-feely talk for a high school football team. Let me just emphasize real quickly that team's had an incredible amount of success on the field as well. 8 out of 9 years that Joe was there coaching, conference champions in the most difficult conference in this city of Baltimore. 4 of those 9 years undefeated and ranked number 1 in the entire state of Maryland. Several times ranked in the national rankings put out by USA Today, climbing as high as number 12 a couple years ago in that national poll. But while others are teaching the blocking and the tackling and the X's and the O's, here's what Joe is concentrating on the most. Concepts such as these. Now figure this out for a high school football team. Concepts such as kindness, empathy, integrity, inclusion, living a life of service to others, bringing all your talents both on and off the field. Sounds a little bit like leadership program, doesn't it? Sounds a little bit like the long history this school has of service, community service for others. I'm going to ask you to look at it in a totally different context for just a moment. I want you to think about this. The head and the heart, physically in your body, on average, are about 17 inches apart. But boys and men in our culture are taught every single day in many different ways that what we're supposed to do as boys and as men is always lead with the head, never with the heart. In fact, those 17 inches, we're taught at a pretty young age through a multitude of messages that we're supposed to sever that 17-inch connection, just slice it apart, yank that head and heart as far apart as they can be, and never let them connect again as we walk through this world as boys and men. Think about that high school football program, your leadership program, your community service projects as a way to reconnect the head with the heart and know that it's not only allowable to keep those things together, but it is the way to live a life of substance and impact. It's the only way to live that life and to build that community that I know you all want. You know, a lot of people have the misimpression, especially I do a lot of work in the inner city schools as well. And boy, you go into those schools, and any time you talk about kindness, there's a big mistake there. A lot of people equate kindness with softness. Kindness isn't softness. Kindness is actually the greatest show of strength you can possibly have. Why? Because it shows, it illustrates to anyone around you that you're so comfortable with who and what you are. You so believe in what you're doing that you can share yourself in a very comfortable way with others through that kindness that you exhibit. I expect greatness out of you, Joe once told the boys. And the way we measure greatness, the only way we measure greatness, is the impact you make on other people's lives. If you leave here today with nothing else, I'll hope you leave with that new, which is really old, definition of success, and then this definition of greatness. Because I doubt that you've ever heard greatness defined that way before. That the only thing that matters is the impact you make on the lives of others. That's a unique philosophy that leads to an awful lot of special moments for the boys in that football program. I also want to share with you my own personal thread before we wrap up this morning. It's the father-son piece. Here's what happened to me during that football season of 2001, which I ended up spending on a high school football field in Baltimore with these boys and men. What I came to realize, it wasn't intentional, but I ended up going through that Building Men for Others program myself, just as an observer and then unknowingly becoming a participant, because you can't help but go through some of your own self-evaluation, your own inner journey, if you were exposed to everything going on in this school community at Gilman in Baltimore. Now, what I did, I went on this self-evaluation. The first thing I did was I looked at that cause piece, and that was a really easy one for me to tick off on my list. Why? Because as mentioned in the introduction, I've spent all these years working on organ donor awareness. See, I had a younger sister, Wendy. In 1989, my younger sister, my only sister, my best friend, Wendy, was in a coma, and we were told she had only 24 hours to live. Hepatitis B had destroyed her liver. She needed a liver transplant to save her life. She was so far gone, it got to the point we were told she had only 24 hours to live. That's a very difficult time to go through, but here's what we learned. We learned that our nation has a horrible shortage of organ donors. We knew that Wendy needed a transplant to save her life. We were so fortunate that the very next day, a donor came and Wendy came back to us. Her comeback was absolutely miraculous. We made a decision right then that we couldn't just take that and accept it as a family without trying to reach others on that issue. So Wendy and I and Carl Lewis, some of you may have heard of him, the Olympic champion, most successful Olympic athlete in the history of our nation. Carl worked with us, and the three of us formed that foundation and spent 14 years touring the nation working on that issue. So I checked that one right off the list. Then I went to my relationships, and I kept coming back to my relationship with my dad. Now, I always knew my dad loved me. I always knew that by the way he treated me, but it's nothing he could ever talk about. My dad was a stoic. My dad was a guy who kept his emotional thermometer stuck right in the middle, no highs, no lows, and even if you felt them, you certainly wouldn't express them. So there were all kinds of things we talked about as a father and a son, but there were also all kinds of things that were beyond the realm of our ability to have conversation with each other. So I kept examining that deal right there, and I realized that for me to be whole as a person, for me to be who I want to be, I had to work on that relationship with my dad all these years later. I went up to New York, where he lives, Thanksgiving weekend of that football season, 2001. And we started a conversation that weekend that has really been going on ever since. It has changed my life and who I am, and I know it's changed my dad's life and who he is. I have had the ability to watch him over these years since, these 6 years, not only impact our own relationship, but all of his relationships. My dad's 73 years old now, and I am so thrilled to see him and to know how certain channels of his life have now opened up as a result, again, of all this stuff going back to a high school football field in Baltimore. I want to share with you one of the worst moments of my life, not because I want to bring you down, not because I want to bring myself down, but because I think it illustrates better than anything else I could tell you how impactful this can be in your own lives. In 2003, my sister Wendy became very sick again. The hepatitis B, that uninvited poison, had never cleared her body, flared up again, destroyed her new liver. Wendy needed another transplant to save her life. Well, this time that transplant never came. 19 people a day in our country die waiting for a heart, kidney, lung, liver, pancreas, whatever the case might be. Now, I had talked about that for years. I had worked on it for years, but I never really knew what that meant until October 28, 2003, when I held my little sister, my best friend, as she took her final breath in this world. Wendy was 36 years old when she died. Now, there's not a whole lot of positive stuff to take out of a hospital experience like that. Yet I have these two threads that I hang on to, and they help me every single day. The first is being able to look back on my dad, to think about the way he was able to spend those final days of Wendy's life in that hospital room with her, and be there so fully present both physically and emotionally in ways that I know he never would have or could have done prior to this journey we went through. That gives me incredible peace to know that my dad was able to do that with my sister. And then that second thread, I look back on my sister's life and know that in 36 years, she was a woman built for others, unlike any other human being I've ever seen. Her relationships, her cause, were so intense and so meaningful that she was able to achieve, by our definition of achievement and greatness, so much more than any of us will ever do if we live to 136 years. That again gives me great peace and comfort and tremendous respect as a brother. Those are the threads that I'm able to hold on to. Ultimately, what Joe taught me was that we never ever stop learning, even as adults, because we never run out of opportunities to enhance the relationships that mean the most to us. We never run out of chances to impact the lives of others. And we absolutely never, ever run out of opportunities to love and to be loved. I believe the messages are timeless and universal, and if you apply them to your own lives, to the lives of your family, to your school community, to the greater community beyond, you will literally change the world around you. In fact, I will leave you with this challenge as you walk out today, and I am absolutely certain of this. The question is not, can you change the world around you? Now, you may sit here and think, well, we're in high school, we're not supposed to be doing that yet. Baloney. The question is not, can you change the world around you? The only question is, will you decide to do so? Thank you very much for having me here this morning.